Alright, hello everyone. Okay, so in this video, let's talk about primitive type variables and class type variables. Okay, and so what is a primitive, type variable, right? We've seen the primitive data types, integers, so basically ints, doubles, floats, shorts, bytes, longs. We've seen all these primitive data types. Now, what is a primitive data type? Also, what is a primitive type variable? We know we can do something like this. We can create, let's say, a double, and we can give it a name and say my balance, right? And then we can initialize it with a value of, let's say, 2.0, 2.4, and then with a semicolon terminate it. And so we know this is a primitive data type double, right? And this variable here, okay, since this is a primitive data type, this variable here becomes a primitive type variable. The difference is, or basically, well, we'll compare it later on, but then what a primitive type variable here, okay, is that it stores this 2.4 value directly in this variable. 2.4 is stored directly in this variable, and that's all it can do, right? That's all this variable does. It stores a value, and that's it. And it stores the value directly. That's what a primitive type variable is. Now let's talk about the class type variable. I'm going to basically comment this out. Well, let me not comment. Let's just delete this. Okay. Now in the previous video, we looked at how to declare a class type variable, right? We said string full name. This is the class that we are going to use, or so the class that we are going to create string objects from. And this variable is going to, in the future, right? This is just a variable. It doesn't hold a string object yet, but it's a variable that is in the future going to hold a string object, which is created from the string class here. Now we talked about the fact that primitive type variables hold the data, okay, themselves, but then class type variables do not hold the data themselves, right? Class type variables hold what's called an address. Okay, they hold what's called an address. Now, we haven't looked into basically creating string object, but then let me initialize this to a string. We talked about the fact that strings are basically a series of characters, right, jumbled up together and then surrounded with double quotations. And so this is a string here. Now, you may think that this value now is going to be stored in full name, but anytime you have a class type variable, this is a class type variable because, again, it's a variable that is in the future going to hold a string object. Well, in this case, it's going to hold this. We may think that this string object, right, is going to be stored here, but class type variables don't hold the data directly, right? They hold what's called the memory address, okay, the memory address of the string object. Now, I know this is getting confusing, but don't worry, don't go worry. We'll get more into classes and objects and methods later on. But I just want you to have an idea, so that in the future, when we start working with strings, you may have a clear understanding of it. So that's the difference. Primitive type variables hold the data directly themselves, and they just hold the value, and that's it. Class type variables, however, you may think hold the string. We already talked about the fact that strings are objects, right? You may think they hold the string objects themselves directly, but no, they don't. Anytime we create a string object in memory, right, the string object is created, all right, but then what's stored, okay, basically it has an address. It's just like you have a house and you have an address for your house. Anytime you build your house, you have an address for your house. Anytime we create an object, the strings are object. Anytime we create an object, it has an address, and that address is basically what's assigned to the full name variable. That's the difference between a primitive primitive type variable and a class type variable. The class type variable holds the address of the object, so it refers to the object. So normally, sometimes you call this a reference variable because it refers to the object. In this case, it's referring to this string object. And a primitive type variable holds the value directly, and it just stores the value, and it can only store the value. But this, however, stores the memory address, the address or the location of this string object. don't get too confused. We'll talk more about objects and classes, but I just want you to see how it works. We haven't gotten into actually creating or the dynamics of creating a string object, although that's what we are doing here. We've basically created a string object here, and its address has been assigned to full name. But we'll get into it more on how to create a string object in memory. But I wanted you to see the difference between primitive type variables and then class type variables. Okay, if you have any questions, please comment down below and I'll do everything to respond to them. Don't worry too much about like classes and object and all the technical stuff. I just want you to have an overview, and we'll work with strings and we'll talk more about classes and objects for you to have an understanding. So just for now, know how strings work, and you'll be fine in the future when we talk more in depth about strings, classes, object, and so on and so forth. Okay, so if you have any questions, please comment down below and I'll do everything to respond to them. Thank you very much for watching. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time with the next video. All right then, bye bye.